We are about to start the session, and a very big and warm welcome to all of you joining from across the world to this high-level session on powering an inclusive digital economy, the critical role of development cooperation. And this session is co-organized by UNCTAD and the OECD, and it will provide an opportunity to discuss with the members of the development cooperation community and from partner countries how to better harness development cooperation and financing fit for our digitalizing world. And I'm very happy to say that the key findings from the OECD's Development Cooperation Report 2021, which is titled Shaping a Just Digital Transformation, will provide all of us with some insights from data analysis in this area. And I think which is extremely important, because data is not something we have in abundance when we talk about digital economy, and this also applies to development cooperation. Because it's a new area, we don't know how much development cooperation funding goes into the digital area. So I'm very happy to let you know that we have an extremely good a set of panelists. And I also want to let you know that this event is broadcast live and also will be live streaming on UNCTAD Facebook. And we will have interpretation into all UN languages. And this is with interpretation provided through the platform Zoom. So now let me take you through this incredible panel and the speakers we have, and then we will get to the session. So I don't think we need a lot of introduction to our Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, Isabel Durant. DSG, everybody knows you now. You have been throughout the e-commerce week. And then we also have Ms. Susanna Moorhead, and she's the elected chair of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, DAC, since February 2019. And before then, she was the British ambassador to Ethiopia and Djibouti, and UK permanent representative to the African Union, and ECA, Economic Commission for Africa. And then we also have from OECD, Ms. Mayumi Endo, and she's the Deputy Director of the Development Cooperation Directorate at the OECD, and which supports the work of the DAC group. And she has worked at the World Bank and also at the Japanese government's aid agency, JICA. And then unfortunately, we were supposed to have ECOWAS President, Mr. Kasi Bru. He could not make it, but in his place, we have His Excellency Dr. Zuli Bonkongu, and he's the Commissioner for Telecommunication and Information Technology of the ECOWAS Commission. And we have, and to my left, and also Ambassador, you also don't need a lot of introduction in the Palais, but we have Her Excellency Ms. Mere Falameka. She's the permanent representative of the Pacific Islands Forum, PIF, to the WTO since 2013 and accredited as permanent observer of the Pacific Islands Forums to the UN office and other international organizations in Geneva since May 2018. The PIF Secretariat is a close partner of ours in the field of digital development. So Ambassador Falameka, so good to have you here and to have you here at the podium. And then we have Ms. Monica Rubiolo. Monica is the head of trade promotion at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO, and she leads SECO's efforts to foster trade in developing countries that is socially responsible, environmentally friendly, inclusive, and thereby sustainable. And she also oversees Switzerland's support to UNCTAD in the area of e-commerce and the digital economy. And Swiss government is, I guess, an enlightened development partner, which is being very in the forefront of supporting developing countries in digitalization. And then we have Mr. Stephen Pope, and he's the group head of trade facilitation, Go Trade, at Joyce Post DHL, and has been with the group for 10 years. Go Trade draws on DHL's expertise in global trade and logistics to help developing and least developed countries to implement best-in-class policies and procedures at the border and help local businesses to access the global market. I don't think, Stephen, you also don't need a lot of introduction because you have been with us on this e-commerce journey for a while. So that's our eminent panel. So let me start with the welcoming remarks. So Ms. Isabel Durand, Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD. Isabel, you have the floor to offer the welcoming remarks.
Merci, Shamika.
Thank you. I'm going to speak in French. I'll just give you some time to connect to the appropriate channel for interpretation. I represent the international community of donors, private sector partners. Ladies and gentlemen, from the e-commerce week, I'd like to welcome all of you. And the title of this session is, of course, clear. International cooperation is critical if we want to have an inclusive digital economy. Everywhere that we go and everywhere we look, particularly in this room, we see digitalization. This is not just a virtual opportunity, but a real opportunity to contribute to the 2030 agenda. But we know very well, and this is going to be a common thread throughout all of our discussions this week, that developing countries and LDCs lack the necessary capacities to be able to engage and integrate into the digital economy. The result of this, of course, is that this digital tool does not help their development. The inequalities are stark. A third of the global population is not connected. Around 3/4 of people living in LDCs have never been online. And for those who are, their connection is slow, and the price for this connection is relatively high, particularly in proportion to their earnings. Our 2021 report on the digital economy has also shown that the traditional digital divide has become further entrenched because of another divide, that of data. The US and China are at the forefront when it comes to data usage, whereas there are numerous developing countries that are providers of data, but which are unable to market them. If this continues, we will become entrenched in an even more vicious circle than that where we were depending on basic resources. Here, the resource is data, but the value that it generates due to its transformation into artificial intelligence lies elsewhere. So the transformation takes place elsewhere. This is a rather dangerous path. The COVID-19 pandemic has further deepened these digital gaps. The individuals and the country and the businesses that participated in the digital economy previously and before the pandemic been able to continue to work, to trade, and have access to basic services. But those who were excluded before the pandemic have even fallen further behind. The pandemic has also stepped up the process of digital transformation and has sharpened the feeling of urgency that governments and the international community, with which the governments and international community need to respond. This is why we've come here today to think and discuss how we can ensure that cooperation and development is better adapted to our world, which is becoming rapidly more digital. The good news is that the international community and the development community have started to take some steps. During our 15th ministerial conference, member states underscored that digitalization needs to play a key role in the transformation of economies for a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable world. And once again, our member states called for work to be strengthened to help developing countries to become involved and to become further integrated into the digital economy. But the portion of resources for aid for trade that has been earmarked for ITC has gone from 1.2% in 2017 to 2.7% in 2019. This is an increase, but this share remains lower than 3% observed during the 2002 to 2005 period. The donor community that include digitalization in international cooperation strategies as part of their earmarking of resources see that this is an increase, and that's a good thing. But we hope that other development actors and other sectors of cooperation will follow suit, because digitalization has been stressed as an important factor for the Sustainable Development Goals. I'd like to take a moment to thank the donors who've supported our digital commerce and e-commerce programs. They're in the room or connected, so I'd like to express my thanks, because they have been pioneers of the digital economy as a lever for development. Your support has helped to strengthen development gains and helped LDCs, particularly to have access to tools and instruments to develop their digital economy. By supporting research and analysis and technical cooperation, donors such as Switzerland, Germany, or the Netherlands have helped bolster knowledge and capacities of member states to enter into this digital economy. And that's critical, because it's this understanding of the digital model that is key to making it a tool for development. It's also made it possible to improve coordination between governments, development partners, and with the private sector, with civil society, and with a number of other stakeholders to ensure that this development happens across the board. I'd also like to thank our partners, in particular the members of the eTrade for All initiative, who were here this morning to discuss progress and take stock. Their knowledge and experience have helped us to give more robust support to developing countries, to be more specific in the assistance we can provide, because as UNCTAD alone, we're not capable to provide all of this support. So this is a helpful initiative. And I'd also like to hail the decision of the OECD to dedicate its 2021 report on cooperation for development. And they've published a report entitled Shaping a Just Digital Transformation. This is extremely timely, of course, because this is what we're discussing. Establishing a digital economy is essential, but what can we do? What more can we do, and what can we do better? In spite of the recent increase in the share of resources for e-commerce, the funding is not sufficient to meet current needs. So we need to further our efforts. We need to work together. We need to work better and work more. We need to be more coordinated, to be more effective, using our respective strengths and our various strengths, and to make the most of the resources available. Of course, we know resources are limited, and donors also are subjected to all kinds of constraints in their own budget allocations. So we need to be very mindful of how we need to use resources and target needs, or decide how to use resources where we will have greatest impact. As many of the participants in this room are new, it's important that the older partners share with the new partners how they can learn from others. We must also listen to the needs of developing countries and bear in mind a regional perspective as well as a national one. and think about the role that the private sector can play. That's our roadmap. This is what we'll be looking at this afternoon and in the ensuing days. So I hope that the conversation that we have and the discussions over the course of the week will help contribute to these goals. I thank you.
Thank you, DSG, and thank you very much for highlighting the urgency of upscaling development cooperation support. And you said otherwise, the digital and data divides will transform into a massive development divide, and it will be very difficult to bridge these divides. Thank you so much. So let me now invite Ms. Susanna Moorhead, Chair of the Development Assistance Committee of OECD, to offer her welcoming remarks. Ms. Moorhead, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Ms. Chairman, and Isabel, thank you for your opening remarks, which I agree with, and I don't want to repeat. So let me try and add something to that. I actually think it's incredibly important that UNCTAD and the OECD DAC are co-hosting this event. It's a measure of how much we collaborate, and how, as Isabel said, we can't do this unless we work together. The DAC, as many of you know, is a group of 30 of the most generous donors of official development assistance. We're a coalition of the willing, we're like-minded, we're transparent, we're accountable, but also we recognize that we are just one part of a very complex jigsaw. I think it's a measure of the importance that DAC members place on the digital transformation that we devoted last year's development cooperation report to the topic. And I don't want to steal Mayumi's thunder, because I know she's going to present that. It is a recognition that obviously we need to do more, that there are many development challenges, but also many opportunities. So I think in our business, you have to be optimistic. And it's important that we focus on the power, the transformative power of the digital transformation, as well as many of the all too familiar constraints that we're seeing. I think we're, at UNCTAD, so we need to talk about trade and markets, and it's certainly clear that digital access generates markets. That's true. That there's an overwhelming evidence. I mean, one example I really like is Jumia, which is a popular e-commerce platform in Africa, and somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of online vendors are women, which is far more than would be the case if you were looking at officially registered businesses. It also gives poor people, people living in remote rural areas, people who wouldn't normally have access to even national markets, let alone global ones, the potential to engage in those markets. So it's not just about aggregate levels of access, it's about who, and as Isabel said, how much it costs. I mean, we consulted with huge numbers of people for the development cooperation report, and I'm sure Mayumi will give you a flavor of the response, but it seems to me that there's a handful of key messages. The first is that although digital transformation is modern and new, it's got that terrible tendency to repeat the same mistakes of so much development. So to exclude the most vulnerable, to discriminate against women, to reinforce barriers of inclusion and exclusion. And I think it's incumbent on us as development professionals, as providers of development cooperation, to do what we can to learn the lessons of other transformations and to try not to repeat the same mistakes. It's also essential that the principles of development effectiveness, which all partners and DAC members have signed up to, focus on results, transparency and accountability, country ownership, predictability, that these are as important for digital transformation as for anything else. We need country leadership, we need vision, we need political backing, and we need to focus, yes, on the quick wins, but also on the longer term structural issues about regulation and making sure that digital technology reaches the parts that it wouldn't otherwise do. So what our report commits to is using our scarce, precious, highly concessional development cooperation resources to help developing countries deliver their own strategies, engage critically, I think, in international conversations about how you regulate, how you take forward the next phase of digital transformation. And perhaps more than anything, how you harness that transformative power. I mean, really many years ago now, I remember the first time we got mobile banking into Kenya, into slums in India. And it's an overused word, but to give people who have relied on cash and extorting money lenders their entire lives access to mobile money and a bank account does change the lives of poor women and poor men. I've seen it in education, children who would never normally have had access to anything other than a not very well-trained teacher, a blackboard and a piece of chalk. Even if you have 30 or 40 of them around an iPad, that changes lives. I've seen it in the health sector, local birth attendants being supported by trained midwives and obstetricians to deliver breech births through the medium of digital technology. So, if used well, it can get into every part of people's lives and deliver across the Sustainable Development Goals. If used badly, it will reinforce the challenges that we all face. So let me finish there. And I think just a plea, I'm delighted DHL is on the panel. We really need the private sector here. Development cooperation, we published the 2021 data about 10 days ago. It's a little up from last year. It's basically stable, which is an extraordinary achievement given the pandemic, given all the fiscal pressures that members are under, but demand is rising exponentially. And I know we should be putting more into digital transformation, but the question we then have to ask is, well, what do we put less into? So I think, of all the sectors and all the potential, the private sector can really step up here and work alongside the public sector and take some of the risks that are going to yield huge returns at some point in the future. So, let's work together. Let's recognize that yes, more resources matter, but it's also about building on lessons learned, best practice and best policies. And I hope Mayumi can tell us a bit more about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Moorhead, and thank you very much for highlighting that the lessons from other transformation, that we need to take these lessons seriously so that we don't make the same mistakes when harnessing the power of digital. I think this is well said. So let's now go to Ms. Mayumi Endo, and we will hear from her the main findings of the Development Cooperation Report 2021. As I said, I don't know, when I think about data, we all have data everywhere, but when it comes to when it matters, we simply don't have data to understand the size of the digital economy, understand how big is the digital, the development cooperation going into this area, the trends. None of this stuff is there. So I think it's very important that this work is done at DAC. So Ms. Endo, you have the floor.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, very good.
Yeah, I can hear you and I can also see your presentation.
Okay, very good. So thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you, Ms. Durant and Susanna for the opening remarks. I think it's a very good segue for my presentation now. I'm delighted to be with you today to share the main findings from our latest Development Cooperation Report, Shaping a Just Digital Transformation, as input into today's discussion. We very much welcome this opportunity to co-host this event with UNCTAD, and let me also take this opportunity to thank the team at UNCTAD for your input and partnership on this report. In fact, we see from our figures that chapters relating to trade and e-commerce are among the ones that receive the highest access. Clearly, our readers are placing great importance on this topic, and building on the DAC chair's remarks, it's clear that trade and e-commerce are areas in which digital tools and the right enabling environment can have very direct development impact. So what I will do in the next few minutes is walk you through the main findings from our flagship report, which sets out the different digital realities that development countries face, areas for action for the international community, as well as new agenda for development cooperation in this field. So next, please. Next slide, please. Yes. So since the COVID-19 pandemic began in 2020, nearly 1 billion additional people came online for the first time, which is a historic jump. But while most everyone in developed countries uses the internet, just over half of the people in developing countries do. Africa has seen much progress with this fiber optic network, increasing fourfold from 2009 to 2019. But in 2021, just a third of people on the continent used the internet, lagging behind other regions. Next, please. So digital investments can open new frontiers for trade and e-commerce, as we have heard, but it can also have impact in many other areas of development, including helping with tax mobilization, underpinning efficient public services such as energy, health, education, and social protection, as we saw most powerfully in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic. So in my time with you today, I would like to talk about how policy levers can unleash the transformative power of digital technology to help build resilience to future crises and shocks and strengthen global security. The international community can play its part by focusing efforts on three main areas, we think. First, by being responsive to different digital realities or different digital contexts in developing countries. Second, by managing universal risks with global cooperation. And third, by supporting more joined up action in this field, including through a new framework for development cooperation. Next, please. So my first point on context, to understand the scale of the challenges in developing countries, let me share some data from our report. Without access, the potential of digital technologies to open new economic opportunity is not fulfilled. According to the World Wide Web Foundation, $1 trillion in gross domestic product has already been lost in 32 developing countries due to the gender gap in internet use. Countries are also foregoing significant tax revenue and business opportunities. The value of imports of digitally deliverable services in Africa's 10 largest economies increased by over 400% in the period 2005 to 2019. But as most African countries have not yet implemented updated rules to facilitate the application of VAT on e-commerce, significant revenues are being foregone. Yes. So with regards to connection, great progress has been made with only 6% not covered by mobile broadband connection. However, this figure goes up to 19% when we look at sub-Saharan Africa. We also need to be mindful of people who tend to be underserved, such as women and people with disabilities. It's also important to note that nearly half of the people who have coverage do not use it. There are many barriers that prevent people from using digital tools, such as lack of relevant content, safety and security, access to electricity, low digital literacy, and cost of data and services. For example, in the Central African Republic, the monthly cost of 1 gigabyte of data is $10. It's the most expensive place in the world to get connected. Next, please. So let me now turn to my second point on the role of global cooperation to manage universal risks. While the potential of digital tools is undeniable, the risks are now clearer. All countries face the risk of increased human rights violations, cyber attacks and cybercrime, data misuse, disinformation, and the deepening of inequalities due to digital transformation. The war in Ukraine is revealing the power and risks of digital communication in conflict situations. Shared norms and rules for governing digital technologies are needed to deal with increasingly complex and cross-border issues. These norms and rules must understand digital security as a key element of global security and take into account the realities and implementation capacity in low and middle income countries. In 2018, the median budget for data protection authorities in non-OECD countries was only 500,000 US, while in OECD country it was $6 million US. Without meaningful representation and voice, many low and middle income countries are currently pushed to adopt inappropriate frameworks and standards that do not meet needs. For example, only 6 of the 75 countries in negotiation on global rules on e-commerce at the World Trade Organization are African countries, and it's important that these negotiations are conducted in an inclusive manner. Next, thank you. So how can we move forward in building inclusive global digital governance? The United Nations Secretary General's roadmap for digital cooperation provides an overarching framework for the international community in this field. We can all work based on this framework. At the OECD, our Going Digital initiative, coordinated by our Science, Technology, and Innovation Directorate, helps all countries to understand and manage the complexity of digital transformation by providing frameworks, principles, norms, and standards. But we know we can do more. First, the OECD is well placed to produce new research and evidence to inform policy advice that countries around the world can leverage to accelerate their digital transformation. It can also help to make these policies more joined up and coherent. Second, OECD can be an inclusive forum to shape a global digital future. The DAC has a unique role to facilitate the participation of developing countries within this architecture. So let me move now to my third and final part of my presentation on the need for a new framework, specifically for development cooperation actors. The 3 key areas for action are, first, ensuring policies and partnership power an inclusive digital future. This means moving beyond the focus on technology deployment to much more holistic strategies and partnering to avoid fragmentation. Particularly in relation to trade, we need to take a holistic approach to remove obstacles along the trade chain and to build functional and enabling environments. Different development cooperation actors have different expertise, and we need to work together to help countries reap the benefits of digital trade and e-commerce. Second, supporting national and regional building blocks for sustainable digital ecosystems, for example, through support to digital public goods and to closing the coverage and usage gaps. An additional $300 billion could be added to the value of e-commerce markets, for example, if gender gaps were closed. Third, making digital financing fit for purpose with greater scale, innovation, and flexibility. Next, please. The estimates in this report indicate that official development finance for digital activities more than tripled since 2015 and 2019. Providers invested a total of $18.6 billion over this period. As you see here, the majority of this financing was channeled through multilateral bodies. While the private sector is expected to meet much of the cost of digital transformation, there's a clear role for concessional finance to help make developing countries' investment environments more attractive and continue to direct focus on reaching those furthest behind. So to conclude, I would like to emphasize that this is a strategic moment for the international community to step up action. The COVID-19 crisis accelerated adoption of digital solutions. Digital technology on the cusp of a new phase, and international standard setting and digital safeguarding is picking up pace, which is happening without much participation of developing countries. So in summary, the international community can shape a just digital transformation by responding to the digital realities of partner countries, working together to address universal risks that make us all vulnerable, and adapting frameworks in relation to the policies pursued, the technology supported, and the financing offered. We at the OECD are convinced that digital transformation can deliver for all countries if we all play to our strengths, partner, empower an inclusive digital future. So with this, I'd like to hand back the floor to the moderator, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you very much, Mayumi, for this very insightful presentation. And I think it it sets the stage for the conversation that we are going to have with our esteemed panel. So let me now move to that part of the conversation. So I think we like to explore how, in view of the COVID-19 pandemic and other global, crises that are being thrown at developing countries, where how development cooperation actors can best work with partner governments, the private sector, and other stakeholders to support development gains from e-commerce and other forms of digital transformation in low and middle income countries. I think this is a point that Isabel, that you highlighted, and also we heard from the Mayumi study. So let me now start with Dr. Bonkongu. You see, you have the ECOWAS Vision 2050 that you just came up recently. And this is to trade and digitalization as being recognized as pillars of regional economic integration and peace. So Dr. Bonkongu, can you tell us what role can development cooperation actors, the private sector, and other stakeholders play in realizing this vision? And what are your thoughts on it? So before I give you the floor, I just want to also let all the panelists know that you have 3 to 4 minutes per speaker. And I'm not very good at shutting people up. So if you can self-monitor yourself, and that would be great. So you have 3 to 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam. Thank you. As you said, the chair would have liked to have taken part in this meeting, but ECOWAS has a great deal of projects on security and on policies. But you asked me as a commissioner, because I'm the commissioner tasked with ITC and digitalization. So I feel very comfortable talking to you today. But that being said, I'll be brief. First, on behalf of the chair of the commission, I'd like to thank Ms. Greenspan, Secretary General of UNCTAD, Susanna Moriad, and the person who just spoke, Mr. Stephen Poe, and all of the guests. I'd like to begin with UNCTAD and for having organized the themes before us on digitalization for development. This is all the more laudable in light of the current challenges. At the moment, I am working on digitalization, and indeed, we were faced with establishing activities during the pandemic. And so this is extremely relevant. Here, we're taking the temperature of how we're working in developing countries and ensuring the inclusion of the digital economy within the heart of ECOWAS. Over the past number of years, and I'm speaking since 2009, we've seen the crisis and the impact on our economies has been enormous. We have seen how the WTO has reduced the predictions for global trade over coming years. Within ECOWAS, we've had to face new restrictions on imports and exports. We have had trouble with our supply chains and logistics. Now, it's clear, and this is connected with what you were discussing, I'd like to tackle the issue of cooperation. Cooperation and effective coordination are critical if we want to ensure that we emerge from this difficult context stronger and more resilient. on the African continent, we need to try to fully implement the commitments undertaken within the African Free Trade Area. Furthermore, and you said this earlier, the vision of ECOWAS lays the foundation for cooperation and coordination in the region. Through this strategic document, the Commission aims to establish an ECOWAS for the people that is fully integrated, living in peace and security with strong strategies for the future. The pandemic has also made it clear that we need to adopt a strategy on digitalization by member states. We did, of course, work on the digitalization of the African continent previously, prior to the pandemic. But the digitalization of the economy is connected to new opportunities, and the crisis shook the resilience. Digitalization, of course, helped children to stay in school and helped small and medium enterprises to connect to broad markets at a low cost. Finally, these digital tools allowed health professionals to provide services and support to patients that needed help. Studies on the impact of the pandemic on trade in the ECOWAS region show that digitalization offers an opportunity for the region to establish new avenues for growth and innovation and access to additional services. The member states of ECOWAS and their development partners in the region need to use the creation of an ecosystem that is competitive and establish ways of strengthening the digitalization of trade and e-commerce. Ladies and gentlemen, thus, the Commission of ECOWAS, in cooperation with UNCTAD and the Netherlands, we have launched the process to establish an e-commerce strategy for the region. As part of this project, we have just assessed the results and the status of e-commerce in the region. This will help the Commission to draw up its strategy for e-commerce. This will be a tool to help strengthen trade and productivity and improve structural transformation. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I'd like to congratulate UNCTAD for organizing this forum and for the support provided to ECOWAS. I think that the various meetings organized over this e-commerce week will provide an opportunity to share our experiences and our various approaches to helping promote sustainable development within the ECOWAS region. I thank you for your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bonkongu. I think, as you said, we will be working with you very closely as we develop the ECOWAS, as you develop the ECOWAS e-commerce strategy. And this gives you a good segue to bring Ambassador Falameka in. Ambassador, you have done the Pacific Regional E-commerce Strategy, and it just came out in 2021, and it builds upon the findings of the e-trade readiness assessments conducted by PIFS and UNCTAD between 2017 and 2021 for 11 Forum Island countries. So I think this will be a good basis. I mean, we have learned a lot from you as we walk into ECOWAS region. So based on your own experience, how do you envisage future cooperation with development actors, the private sector and other stakeholders to take this work forward? Because this is now a regional strategy. It's not just a country by country strategy. So it's very special. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I first of all wish to thank UNCTAD and the OECD for inviting the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat to participate at this high-level session on powering an inclusive digital economy, the critical role of development cooperation. I also want to acknowledge the excellent opening statements made by Madam Durand and Madam Susanna Moorhead from the OECD, and also Madam Durand from the Deputy Secretary General of UNCTAD, which had set an appropriate tone for the discussions this afternoon. We recognize that e-commerce is transforming lives, businesses, and economies around the world. The Pacific Islands Forum has 18 members, of which 14 are small Pacific Island developing countries. And they represent some of the smallest and remotest in the world. But we do not want to be left behind, in the words of the SDG. And we were inspired by the launching of the UNCTAD E-Trade for All in 2024. The Pacific Islands Forum countries recognize the potential of embracing the digital economy to overcome part of the high trade costs associated with our smallness and remoteness, to embrace, to enhance and diversify our trade opportunities, to promote inclusive growth by integrating small and micro enterprises, women, youth, and the rural economy. And lastly, to build trade resilience, a lesson learned from the COVID-19 experience, which witnessed the growth of e-commerce despite the global lockdown. However, to realize these potentials, much work had to be done to overcome the challenges posed by the digital divide, and international development cooperation plays a critical role in this, which brings me to the question that was posed to me regarding the role of development partners in the development of the Pacific Regional E-commerce Strategy. And second, how do we envisage future cooperation with development partners? The development of the Pacific Regional E-commerce Strategy in 2021 is a testament to the cooperation between the Pacific Island Forum members, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, and our international and development partners. This cooperation started at a regional e-commerce workshop for the Pacific, organized jointly by the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, UNCTAD, and the WTO in 2017. That workshop brought together the Pacific Island members and other stakeholders working in the e-commerce space in the Pacific region, such as, of course, UNCTAD, UNESCAP, who works on trade logistics and trade facilitation, ITU, which works on satellite alternative to undersea cables, Asian Development Bank, the Oceania Customs Organization, the private sector, as well as eBay, which is a platform for e-commerce, and development partners, Australia and New Zealand. That workshop also recognized that none of the Pacific countries had any comprehensive strategies on e-commerce. And we needed to have a harmonized approach to e-commerce, given the similar challenges faced by our members, where there is potential for collective action to achieve better results. So the UNCTAD e-trade readiness methodology, or the approach, was chosen by our region as the guiding template for a structured and a holistic approach to addressing e-commerce in the Pacific and to developing our e-commerce strategy. By 2021, 11 national and 1 regional e-commerce assessments were undertaken. 5 were undertaken by UNCTAD for the Pacific LDCs and were funded by the Enhanced Integrated Framework. 7 were undertaken by the Pacific Island Secretariat, which were funded by the European Union TradeCom 2 project, as well as the Government of Australia. These assessments became the basis for the development of the regional e-commerce strategy, which was developed by the PIFs with extensive input from relevant implementing agencies and donors funded by Australia. Apart from the government officials, inputs and validation of the e-commerce strategy was also sought from the private sector and civil society. The regional strategy, which was endorsed by the Forum Trade Ministers in 2021, identifies 54 priority regional measures in the 7 e-commerce pillars identified by the UNCTAD e-trade readiness methodology. That is the policy and strategy, ICT infrastructure, legal and regulatory framework, the e-payment system, access to finance, trade logistics and facilitation, training and skills, as well as training and skills development. The Pacific Regional Strategy would not have been achieved or delivered without development cooperation, without the help of our international and development partners, including the technical input and guidance by technical agencies such as UNCTAD, UNCDF, UNCITRAL, UNESCAP, the World Bank, the Oceania Customs Organization, the Pacific Community, and many others, as well as the financial support of like-minded development partners who agreed to pool resources in support of this strategy, and in particular, the Enhanced Integrated Framework, the European Union, and the Australian government. On the second question of how do we envisage future cooperation with development actors, our answer is simple. On the basis of the region's experience in developing the Pacific Regional e-commerce strategy, we need to engage all stakeholders from the outset. And we also need to have a structured and holistic approach to addressing e-commerce challenges. And UNCTAD e-trade for all assessment provided the basis for our approach to developing the Pacific strategy. The Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat continues to coordinate the development actors in this in the implementation as we move forward on this next phase of the implementation. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Thank you for outlining so very comprehensively the journey towards the Pacific, the Pacific regional e-commerce strategy. And I think this is a lesson for many other regions too. And I'm also wondering whether you could turn your talking points into a policy brief, and then we can issue this as a part of e-trade for all initiatives outputs, because I think it would be very, very valuable, especially for us as we work into ECOWAS, because we have learned from this experience of the Pacific, and it's a real success story. So now let me turn to Ms. Monica Rubiolo. Monica, SECO is a relatively new donor in the area of digitalization for development. Not just a new donor, but an enlightened donor. That's what I said at the beginning, because I think you have come and outlined a great strategy for supporting digitalization. So I'm just wondering, what were the driving considerations for integrating digitalization more strongly as a focus area in your international cooperation strategy 2021-2024? I'm sure there must be lessons for other international donors for that. And then what are some steps SECO has taken to learn from other development partners or the donors active in this area?
Thank you for the opportunity to share with you some of our lessons and experiences in this area. As you say, we are kind of a new donor to the UNCTAD initiative, but it's probably like for many other donors, not a new domain of activities. Although, of course, as Isabel was mentioning, the way how the pandemic has influenced the activities for everybody around the world, also for us in the office, has been a huge difference and a huge push towards digitalization. So let's say that at least what concerns our current strategy, digitalization is perhaps not so prominently featured as it should be. But we are currently in the middle of the process to develop the next strategic framework, which will cover the next 4 years, so 24-28. And we expect to have digital issues and digitalization more prominently featured there. What I can say to concerning the current strategy is that digitalization is still quite important, but as a cross-cutting and perhaps as a component within different initiatives. So the way how we have been active in the domain is not only with UNCTAD, but also with other partners that are part of the Trade for All initiative that you mentioned. The multilateral institutions, the development banks, also the regional organizations. And what is clear that going forward, we want to focus a bit more on a couple of components. One of them concerns GovTech, because many things have been said. You need to have connectivity. You need to ensure accessibility to the digital services. You need to make this access cheaper than what it is currently. You need the infrastructure. And the governments have an important role to play there. So we think that GovTech is really one important element, because if you want to mobilize enough resources and ensure also that there is efficiency in the public expenditure, then digital services are an important part of it. The second important element is fintech, because the financial sector has to play also a role. It has to be to facilitate commerce, to facilitate growth, and to facilitate economic activity. We need to ensure that also the financial sector is up to speed there. And we have seen in many cases in regions like Africa that were pioneers in piloting many financial solutions that we are now taking up in the developed world. So there are many successful examples to look at in the past. The third element that is very important is, of course, as being a trading nation for Switzerland, is the trade area. So e-commerce is an important part of the economic activity. And we have all seen that during the pandemic, we were very happy to see that the global value chains were resilient enough to cope with the pandemic, to continue providing the masks and the devices, the medical devices that people were needing in many regions. So I think that this resilience in the global value chains has been there, but needs to be strengthened in many other cases. And the fourth element important for us was mentioned also by the ambassador and by Ms. Duran, is the issue of skills. We need that people acquire the right skills to be able to participate in this digital transformation. And if you want to reduce the digital divide, to ensure that the data divide is also not there, and that we ensure the accessibility, the consumer protection that also needs to be there. So this requires also the appropriate skills in developing countries. And of course, supporting developing countries and LDCs in this specific endeavor is one of the tasks of the development cooperation. And when we talk about how to cooperate with the donor community and with other partners, I think that events like this one is a great opportunity. We need to share the experience. We need to learn from others that have been working in this area for some years. And we need also to see where the opportunities and risks are, and how to deal with them. So together, we are definitely better than working alone.
Thank you so much, Monica. I think this is so true. I mean, together we are much better than working alone, and it's extremely difficult to work alone in this area, which is a cross-cutting area with enormous needs and enormous challenges. Let me now move to Stephen. Stephen, I think you now represent the private sector side. So how could development cooperation actors better leverage the expertise of the private sector to promote policies and procedures that truly facilitate the development of an e-commerce environment, enabling environment?
Yeah, thank you very much, Madam Moderator. And I'd like to firstly thank UNTAD and the OECD for inviting me to join such an important panel with a really illustrious group. I think, I'd like to start by saying, obviously, there is a long way to go But as John Denton pointed out earlier on, we are heavily engaged. That is, the private sector is heavily engaged already. But yes, there is a lot to do. And led by ICC, we've seen more and more the visibility and the proactive action of the private sector engaging in this key issue and in sustainable and inclusive trade overall, particularly in DCs and LDCs. The first one I'd like to point out is a growing trend that we've seen, I think, the last 5 or 6 years, and that has been alliances of donors partnering with the private sector. A key example is the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation. You have the German Alliance for Trade Facilitation, and of course, this panel itself focuses on COVID-19, and of course, UNDP, UNGC, and ICC got together and formed the COVID-19 Private Sector Facility, of which we're a proud member. And we're working more and more with organizations, international organizations such as ITC, and a relationship with UNCTAD is just incredible. The amount of the variable level of activities that we have with UNCTAD is quite incredible, to be honest, and it's growing day by day. And as the previous speakers just said, this sort of forum is incredibly important for us to find ways together. And this was something that ICC pointed out, that John Denton has said it a number of times. These challenges are something that we need to basically tackle together. And I think you mentioned earlier on, Madam Moderator, as one. And I think that's key in all of that. I think in terms of the relationship and these partnerships, the donors in forming these alliances, bring in all these companies. And I think one of the key areas that we need to look at, and it was something that Ms. Moorhead mentioned earlier on about resources, is one should develop a skills matrix and look at the businesses and what opportunities they present in terms of sharing the burden, in terms of, firstly, bringing in the voice from the bottom for the community, the business community in the country. And of course, the key example is the National Trade Facilitation Committees. And again, UNCTAD has been working together with the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation in helping countries to develop NTFCs, to enable governments in country to learn from their business community on the ground, what the challenges are they face and what's needed. But then again, plugging in companies like ours, we're the world's most international company, we're the world's largest logistics company. Our whole world is digital, and we function in these DCs and LDCs digitally. There are challenges, but we are there, and we do have the skills within the organization that we will gladly share and basically bring into the discussion. And part of the report that the OECD mentioned again was data privacy, and this is something else that the private sector is used to dealing with. We're a German company. We have to deal with GDPR. We deal with data privacy. We deal with data security, and again, this is something that we learn from. And I think the key thing is giving an equal voice to the business community at all levels, top down, bottom up, global and national, and in some cases regional. For example, we're involved in a number of programs in country where what we're looking to do is plug SMEs into global markets. We have a national footprint. Our senior managers are nationals, very often nationals of those countries. Certainly the vast majority of the employees are, if not all of them, the senior management team. So they also have an emotional link to the country in which they're working in. And of course, with a company like ours, they can plug that into the global network. And we're not the only company that involved in that as well. More and more big multinational companies are realizing that it's beholden on the private sector to play that role in supporting donors, in supporting DCs and LDCs to access global markets. And that's something that John Denton and the ICC has pushed very, very sort of clearly. I think the other thing in terms of engagement on the ground is you need to treat collaboration as an equal partnership. And of course, that we need to look at maybe a change of approach to things. It's not always that governments are used to dealing with the private sector. And of course, the private sector also carries a sense of responsibility in that you have to build a trusted relationship. You have to have a shared vision. You have to share the burden. For example, the way that we operate through Go Trade is we operate on payment in kind. In other words, what we do is we utilize the skills and experiences of our people all over the world, and that goes back to what I mentioned earlier on about the skills matrix, to actually actively engage in projects and programs on the ground. If you gather a skills matrix from the private sector, very often you'll find that many employees within those companies started off in the public sector or spent a large period of their careers in the public sector. I'm a key example. I spent 26 years in the public sector before I joined Deutsche Post DHL 10 years ago. So so that's another area in which we can engage. And the other thing that I would look at is, and this is again something that Ms. Moorhead was talking about, is it's tangible outcomes. And this is something that the private sector is actively engaged in every single day. It's part of our bread and butter performance management. It's all about, at the end of the day, delivering tangible outcomes. And this is something that I'm delighted to say that we get engaged with heavily with our donor partners in which we're operating. We agree a strategic plan, there are KPIs, there are deliverables. We're expected to deliver certain things that what we're looking to in terms of outcomes is very clear for everyone to see, and the discipline is there. An example, for example, where we're training SMEs, what we need to see is not only the number of SMEs that we've trained, but how many SMEs are trading cross-border following a 6-month period, and are we seeing growth in volume? And that's not growth in volume within us as a company, it's SMEs across the board. So if we're training SMEs, they don't necessarily trade with us. They can trade with whoever best suits their needs. But what we're looking at with our donor partners is exactly what outcomes are we delivering in terms of this. And the other impact area that we're looking at as well is we measure everything. We're data rich, and I think that's something that Isabelle Durand mentioned earlier on about data. And what we want to do is, and again, we're not alone in all of this. Certainly, this is a discussion that I've been having recently with the E-Trade Alliance. And Kati Sumanen was on a panel earlier on looking at the Pacific Islands, is what sort of positive impact are we having on the ground? If we're engaging on the ground, are we making a difference? Are things improving? So I think, just for a start there, that's where we're coming from. It's about this at a global level, it's alliances. At a national level, it's the NTFCs. It's piloting the reforms in an equal partnership on the ground, sharing that burden. As has been pointed out, there are only limited resources. Well, share that burden with the private sector. We have the skills. We are active in terms of our willingness to engage on the ground. And that way we can move towards a better format. So I'll stop there. I know there's a couple of other questions coming forward, but that is a snapshot overall. And I just want to finish by saying, at a global level, e-commerce week, UNCTAD's role and another international organization, for example, the World Customs Organization, is private sector consultancy group. These are all very, very important bodies and something to be applauded as a way of engaging the private sector in looking at, how best we can look at this across the piece, the multilateral rules-based approach to sustainable and inclusive economic growth through trade. So we are going, there is a lot to do, but we've already come a long way. We just need to keep going. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think I take it from your presentation that you highlighted, share the burden with private sector and engage the private sector. I think this is so true, because without the private sector, you're not going to see the outcomes in terms of increased trade, cross-border or otherwise. These are very good points. So let me now turn to the second part of our conversation. And this is now, we are looking at how to ensure the meaningful participation of developing countries in inclusive global processes, either dealing with development partners or global processes, such as designing the rules and values underpinning the digital future. So let me get some of your views on this. Ambassador Falameka, can I start with you?
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Our response to that question, basically, that is a very important part of our work as developing countries to engage at multilateral fora on e-commerce, as we have seen, particularly from our own experience in development of the e-commerce strategy. The e-commerce is very complex. It cannot be addressed by one simple policy. There is a plethora of policies that need to be integrated together. And for us, having developed the Pacific e-commerce strategy, this is not the end. This is the beginning of work to address the digital divide that we face in the Pacific region. And therefore, for us in particular, with this e-commerce strategy that we have, that our ministers have endorsed, we would be looking to our development partners, to the international cooperation, to help us with the implementation. We have calculated that the strategy will cost USD 50 million. We have secured 5.5 million already to begin the work of implementation. At the moment, we are looking at the 54 regional measures under the 7 pillars to be implemented. And we're doing a mapping exercise based on the work that we have already undertaken with international stakeholders and the private sector, civil society, to see which stakeholders are working in different fields. And that mapping or monitoring and evaluation exercise will be built into our e-commerce Aid for Trade database that will be launched in June. That will then identify what measures other development partners are working on, or other international partners are working on, that we can work with, and those that fall in the gaps. And so for us, that is a very important exercise, and I'm very happy that UNCTAD is developing a digital economy report for the Pacific, and is already working in some of the areas that we are interested in working with UNCTAD, particularly on the policy and strategy front. That said, as we said, the gaps remain, and particularly in the area of skills. E-commerce data is a particularly important area for us. When we look across the databases of UNCTAD, WTO, the World Bank, we cannot find Pacific data on e-commerce. So this is one area which the Pacific Island Secretariat, Forum Secretariat, UNCTAD, and the Secretariat of the Pacific Community are working together on to build a database for e-commerce data for the Pacific that can be used for the other international institutions. So I'm just highlighting some of the approaches that we take, and just to emphasize the importance of working not only at the national level, because none of us developing countries, and particularly very small countries like us that do not have the technical capacity to address everything, that we can fall back on our international partners. International partners such as the technical agencies such as UNCTAD, UNESCAP, UNCDF, and others, as well as our development partners who could support this initiative. Thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And it's also, what you have shown is the ownership of the region for the product. And, we have exact 54 measures that you have outlined. So, I mean, I really do hope that you will get the 50 million that you have, budgeted for the strategy. And I think this is yet again, this is really a good practice. So let me now turn to Ms. Robiolo. So from a Swiss perspective, how could development cooperation better integrate developing countries' voices and views on issues, not just the connectivity, but other issues like control and access to data, the cybersecurity, and digital governance? You know, they are more difficult one. As Ambassador Falameka says, this is where a lot of developing countries also don't have technical capabilities. So Monica, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I think this is a very tough, but at the same time, a very key question. So we need to have the voice and the ideas and the needs clearly spelled out from developing countries, and have them participating also in the discussions around, let's say, the rule book on e-commerce and digitalization globally. And this is clearly the position of Switzerland. I think we as a host of the many agencies of the multilateral system, we have a very clear statement supporting the multilateral negotiations. And we are also convinced that some of the initiatives, like the joint statement initiative, which is being supported by more than 80 countries, is a good start to really discuss this rule book and to discuss rules that cover all the domains that were mentioned also by the ambassador in a participatory manner. I think that what we have seen is that it's very important to integrate the voice of developing countries in all other activities. We are trying, hope that we can do that further in the future, to integrate them also in programs like the ones being implemented by the UNCTAD, that the ICTE ECD program can better integrate also developing countries' voices. I think that we need to make sure that all the analytical work that is being done and conducted is truly consulted with the recipients, so that we get not only an idea of perhaps the main ministry that is in charge of the exercise on the government side, but also of all other stakeholders, including the private sector at the country level. Because as it was mentioned before, it's very important that we ensure the participation of all relevant stakeholders. And this is a number of voices also in developing countries. It's exactly the same in more advanced countries. So I think that joining forces also with other agencies, the regional banks were mentioned, which typically also represent the voice of the countries, the member countries, is an important actor. We need to look for ways to involve them better. But believe in the multilateral system and try to contribute constructively. I know that there are voices that consider some of the regulatory initiatives as too protectionist, and we need to make sure that these are not the new trends, or if there are trends, that they don't become permanent. We have benefited a lot from a free system that ensures the exchange between all the participants, including developing countries. So I think that this is more than important for the digital economy.
Thank you. Thank you very much for highlighting that very important point of the value of multilateralism and the value of opportunity to trade among each other without enormous amount of barriers. So I'm going to now move to Dr. Bonkongu. If you could tell, but in about 3 minutes, because we will be, I think our interpreters will stop interpretation soon. So if you can take about 3 minutes and tell the regional strategy that you are developing for e-commerce, and how are you going to ensure that all the member states are going to participate, and it is truly a multi-stakeholder endeavor.
Thank you, Madam. As I was saying earlier, I'm responsible for the digitalization environment, and my colleague who works on e-commerce is not there today. As you all know, e-commerce enjoys a lot of support. Those of you who know our region, and somebody mentioned this earlier, you know that the quality of the internet connection is important as well as the cost. So our work is based on these pillars. We're trying to create regulations because we're a regional organization and we support member states to try to streamline policies and create a ripe environment. After all, it's the private sector that sets up this infrastructure. Earlier, I heard the representative from DHL speak, and it's true that we need to work on these areas. So e-commerce needs to improve these areas to guarantee development. Well, I mean, it's obvious, you might say. What does the region need? Well, we need to try to ensure the survival of e-commerce. How do we do this? On infrastructure and policies on digitalization, and that's what we deal with within our division. So whether that be e-commerce or e-banking, well, these are aspects which help support the development of e-commerce. We can't conduct e-banking if we don't lay the foundations for it. There's something else that I wanted to raise. When you connect to the internet in European countries, usually there's no problem. In Africa, no matter where you try to connect, people are concerned. Why? Because of cybercrimes. This is a scourge that hampers development and usage of e-services. So within the Commission of the African Union, and more particularly in my department, we have designed a 3-year program that we are currently implementing. This is to combat cybercrime and to ensure capacity building for member states and for all actors in the field of cybersecurity. We need to create an appropriate environment. So that people can be serene when they use applications. This is the first thing that we're trying to tackle. And of course, we're happy to share our experience in this area. So as I said, our main concern is to build capacities and resilience by combating cybercrime. That's what I have to say as to the role that we're playing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this has been also clearly demonstrated throughout the couple of days that how important to build trust in internet when you want to do, when you want to engage in digital economy. So thank you so much for outlining some of the work you do in ECOWAS in this regard. So Mr. Pope, let me now go to you, but very briefly, in a couple of minutes, 2 minutes, can you also tell us, I think you mentioned these things in your earlier intervention, but just to kind of summarize private sector, how can private sector be further engaged to maximize the impact of development cooperation? What can you do to add a lot more value to the development cooperation efforts?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Moderator. And as I mentioned earlier on, the key is engaging us actively on the ground. The private sector has a huge role to play in actually piloting reforms supporting development of new strategies on the ground. And I'm delighted that we're engaged with the World Bank and the E-Trade Alliance for USAID in the Pacific Islands, which is just kicking off. I do want to touch on one area which is pretty much a big chunk of the work that I have within the Go Trade team, and that focuses on skills, which Ms. Rubio mentioned earlier on, and that we've developed a large suite of training programs which we share with our donor partners on the ground. The principal aim is to equip SMEs to access global markets. So we run them both online and we run them in classrooms. So it's dependent on, obviously, restrictions of COVID. But the other advantage that we have as well, if we do them online, is SMEs don't always have the resources or the time to travel to cities or certain places for training programs. So they can do them online as well. And in terms of sort of female entrepreneurs, it is an unfortunate fact that women do carry the vast majority of the burden in terms of family and managing households. But at least 50% of the SMEs that we engage with are female SMEs. In some cases, 100%, because we're heavily involved with ITC C-Trades program. So we offer this training online as well, in DCs and LDCs. The other thing that we've developed as well, which I think is absolutely key, is we've developed a new mentoring program with the Global Business Schools Network, where we take MBA students from top business schools around the world and we put them together with an SME and mentor them. And the two work together over a year at least, where the SME can learn from the MBA student about their theoretical learning. They will have practical work experience. They have to have work experience to be able to support them. And so they gain from the skills that the MBA student has, but at the same time, what it also does is it teaches the MBA student about the challenges of working in certain environments. As Dr. Bokongo mentioned earlier on about the challenges of the internet in these developed economies. This is an opportunity for these MBA students to use their skills to work together in partnership to help that SME to be successful and including facing the challenges. And what we hope as well is that cross-cultural development will also create greater understanding of the real challenges that are out there. So that there's a key example of that. I think the final one I would say in terms of utilizing the private sector, if a government isn't going to engage with a private sector, you need to engage fully. It needs total political support from the government, whether it's the ministers of trade, development, ministers of finance, really need to engage. Private sector needs to be trustworthy. The dialogue needs to be transparent. It needs to be outcome focused. But when governments fully engage and are fully committed, as we're hearing from the ambassador for the Pacific Islands, that is the path to success. And there we can share the success. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very, very critical element that you have highlighted. And many times, I think you mentioned about the NTFCs. Many times we see if the governments are not so keen on NTFCs, the first people to drop out of this National Trade Facilitation Committees were the private sector. Because as you said, if the private sector is not engaged fully from the beginning in a transparent manner, they may not engage. And then there is, you can design all the policies you want, but there will not be results on the ground. I think this is an extremely important point. So now I have Australia from the floor.
Thank you, moderator, and good afternoon to our panelists and participants as well. Thank you for a very engaging panel session this afternoon on a very important topic. My thanks also go to UNCTAD and OECD co-organisers for inviting Australia to join this high-level session on the role of development cooperation, empowering an inclusive global economy. Australia's Deputy Permanent Representative to the WTO, Jeremy Green, sends his apologies for not being able to participate in the panel this afternoon, but I'm pleased to be delivering this statement on his behalf and to provide a bit of an update on Australia's development cooperation activities in this space. As the panel has highlighted today, e-commerce, digital trade and the digital economy provide an enormous and potentially transformative opportunity to accelerate economic recovery and resilience while also promoting inclusive development. There is no doubt that the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the importance of technology to the global economy. At the same time, it has highlighted numerous challenges faced by least developed countries and developing countries in maximising the benefits from e-commerce, as you've outlined today. Without the necessary technical assistance and capacity building, the digital divide in LDCs and developing countries will worsen, reducing their ability to engage in a rapidly digitising global environment. Australia is very pleased to be partnering with governments, the private sector, regional organisations and others on a range of initiatives to provide e-commerce technical assistance and capacity building to LDCs and developing countries. This includes Pacific Island countries, which face some common challenges, including geographic remoteness, small domestic markets, and also high trade costs. Australia's e-commerce aid for trade fund is assisting LDCs and developing countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific to maximise the benefits of digital trade by increasing their e-commerce capabilities. Since the fund was established in 2019, it's supported over 850 MSMEs develop specialised e-commerce skills. And an important dimension of the fund is to encourage the adoption and the adaptation of innovative technology in promoting inclusive participation and capacity building. I'll provide a couple of examples of those. They include an online dispute resolution platform in Vietnam, a one-stop tourism booking platform in Vanuatu, Myanmar's first agribusiness phone app, helping farmers to buy inputs and sell produce, and also a blockchain-based digital platform providing proof of provenance and traceability for online products for sale in Vietnam. Through the fund, Australia's also outlined and supported the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat to undertake a regional e-commerce strategy and roadmap. And we've heard a little bit about that today from the Ambassador. Thank you. This involved intensive multi-stakeholder engagement and prioritisations of regional actions to support e-commerce capacity development. Examples include adopting common policies to harmonising rules, data collection and portals, skills development, lowering market barriers, developing common institutions, and also establishing regional delivery mechanisms. We greatly appreciate his efforts to progress the implementation of this strategy, which complements national efforts and is promoting donor coordination at a regional level. The roadmap will also help drive the move towards online trading, which will reduce trade costs and promote diversification and resilience among Pacific economies. Our Pacific Digital Economy Program also works with governments, regional and local Pacific stakeholders to improve financial access, literacy and inclusion aspects in the broader digital economy, and is working with PIFs to identify and implement activities that align with the strategic measures outlined in the Pacific Regional E-commerce Roadmap. I'd like to thank our partners at UNCTAD, UNCDF and UNDP for their continued work in this space. Initiatives such as the E-commerce Aid for Trade Fund and PDEP complement Australia's digital connectivity investment in undersea cables in the Pacific region, which provide faster, more affordable and reliable communications essential to conducting and promoting trade. And lastly, I'll just mention the WTO JSI e-commerce initiative, which Australia co-chairs along with Japan and Singapore. And this is also an example of a global process where rules for our digital future are being designed with a conscious and explicit aim of inclusion for LDCs in developing countries. Inclusion has been a core principle of the e-commerce JSI since the 2019 ministerial statement launching the negotiations. We are also looking at ways to provide further support to LDCs in developing countries to take on ambitious rules in digital trade and share in many benefits through this initiative. So to conclude, I'd just like to reiterate our thanks again to UNCTAD for hosting the e-commerce week initiative, which really provides an important multi-stakeholder forum for continuing efforts to collect information and share best practice and lessons learned on how development cooperation can help build e-commerce readiness. Thank you.
Thank you very much, outlining Australia's efforts to support developing countries in e-commerce and the digital economy area. So this is very good, and thank you for that, those remarks. I don't see any flags up in the room, so I think I'm going to give a minute or two. Okay, I would like to now to turn to our the panelists and to share their kind of a final thoughts. What's the key message? Maybe in 1 or 2 sentences. Ambassador Falamaker, can I start with you?
Yes, thank you, Madam Moderator. Yes, my final comment is that e-commerce is complex, and we need the cooperation of all our stakeholders, our international organizations, technical organizations such as UNCTAD, UNESCAP, UNCDF, and others, as well as our development partners to assist us, and thank Australia for the intervention this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well said. Monica, can I ask you, please?
Yes, thank you. I was just trying to pick up the words that I noted through the conversation, and there is a nice number of adjectives which to me denote action. So for me, it's about leveraging, learning, sharing, partnering, and really strengthening the participation for adapting the rule book. I think I will keep to those words. I think many of the participants came back to these concepts, and I hope that with this we're able to shape this e-commerce in the future in a better manner.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Dr. Bompungu, you have a minute for your final thoughts.
Yes, I just want to repeat, maybe I will repeat myself by saying, but we need, of course, international cooperation, but in the way to improve the environment for e-commerce development. I'm saying regulation and infrastructure access to internet and security. This is what I'm thinking about. That if we make what, I don't know, but if we have international cooperation right now, I think it will be good for us in our region really to set up the environment to support the development of e-commerce. And again, the actors, member state, all the actors, private sector, we need to have capacity building for that. I think I will add capacity building also for that. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Stephen, would you like to take the floor for 1 minute?
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. Yes, from my side, of course, it's about public-private engagement. Let's work together. Let's do this as one. Let's share the burden. And that's the way that we will find tangible outcomes for sustainable and inclusive economic growth through trade. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So can I please give you the floor, Isabel? I think you have probably gained enormous amount of wisdom, throughout these 2 days, being with us constantly.
And first of all, of course, there is a lot of agreements, principal agreements between us regarding cooperation, synergies, etc., etc. And of course, I warmly welcome those agreements. But I would like also to just look at 2 issues which are also important. First, we have also probably to build or to better know our differences. or where we disagree. What could happen, of course, no problem. That's the multilateral system too. So I think that it's also important to look where there are different interests or different approach in order to help us, UNCTAD, to propose and to try to help the building of consensus, especially regarding the governance and all the aspect of regulatory framework. The second remark that I would like to do is also related to the people who are not in the rooms, vulnerable groups, very small countries, not very well represented in all different organizations. And I think that it's also important that in all our network, we can also try to include all those who are not exactly on the same level of knowledge or participation in all the process. And I think that that's also our respective responsibility to include all those who are far behind today and who have to really trying to go a little bit further in the process of participation in this digital framework. Finally, I think that we have also to look at gender balance. I think that that's also something, it's not because we are only women here on the panel. I think that we know it's not because women are vulnerable or small or minority. They are not a minority, they are the half of the world. But it's true that for many reasons, they are not really enough represented or enough visible regarding their participation in the process. And it's why we started also with the support of Netherlands, the E-Trade for Women initiative. We will have a session on that. I think that it's after tomorrow. Nevertheless, I think that it's a permanent attention, not only E-Trade for Women is the only way to include and also to benefit of all creativity and capacity of women to be part of this process. So that's also something that we have to keep in mind. That's my temporary remarks. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Isabel. I think with these wise words, let's close this session and please give a big hand to our excellent speakers.